Welcome to week 4 of organizational behavior. I'm your online instructor, Diana Block. And in week 4, we're going to read chapters 7 and 8. And in chapter 7, we are talking about the process of communication. So there's a lot of great information in this chapter on communication, and I just want to highlight a few of them with you for a few minutes today. So when we look at communication, you're going to read in chapter 7 about the actual communication process and what that process consists of. And most of you have probably seen that before. You receive a message, you decode the message, form a response, encode that response, and then transmit the message. And the other person on the receiving end does the same thing. They receive their message, decode it, form their response, encode it, and then transmit that response. So in other classes, you may have seen that before. So we want to review that here and then also talk about some other concepts. Some things that I thought you would find interesting was the discussion on gender roles and how gender styles rather relates to communication. Particularly on page 185, there's some discussion about different gender styles, and it explains that men often use report talk, which report talk is the exchange of information. You're talking for the purpose of giving and receiving information. Now, while women do this as well, often women also employ rapport talk. So, rapport talk is conversation that is not actually aimed at transmitting information back and forth, but the purpose of the conversation is actually to build relationships. So, of course, you're going to say, well, both genders employ both of those, which they do. It's just that report talk is more commonly used among men, and rapport talk is used more by women than men, according to studies. But of course, there's exceptions to every rule, and everyone uses all of these concepts at some point or another. But it's interesting to look at the difference between the point of the conversation, whether the point of the conversation is to exchange information or to actually build relationships. Another concept you I often find interesting is the concept of agonism, and this is most often employed by men. And this is, the book says, a warlike oppositional style of interaction. And it actually, although it is warlike and oppositional, is not fighting. This is what we see when you have a group of men and they begin discussing sports, and they get excited about who was MVP and who should have been MVP and whether the ref was wrong or whether the ref was right, and there's a big argument. You get a bunch of men together, bring up a sports topic, the most recent game, and often you will see this big explosion and everybody's yelling, and and it seems like they're angry, but they're not. Women are more likely to feel like this kind of interaction is a fight and be upset about it later because we had a big argument. Whereas men, you will notice, can have this big conversation, this huge argument about the game or about a car or whatever the conversation is. They have this big argument back and forth, and they're actually still friends and they're still happy, and they continue to hang out later in the day, and it's all past. So we've seen that before. I'm sure most of us have. So those are just some examples of some of the topics that I thought you may find interesting when we talk about communication, beyond just the communication process that you've probably studied before. Another big thing I want to discuss in this chapter is the concept of trust, because I think trust relates to the homework assignment on the Mayo Clinic that you're going to complete. And so most of us know what trust is, and it's basically an expectation that you have about someone else's behavior. If you trust someone, that means that you believe you know how they're going to react in certain situations. You know what they will do and what they would not do. So you trust them to be what you believe they are. The text points out some different categories of trust that we should be aware of that affect us in the workplace or in relationships. When we talk about calculus based trust, we're talking about a trust that is established because there is some reason that a person is being deterred against certain actions. So here's what an example of what we're saying there. We will trust that we're going to be treated reasonably at work because there are mechanisms in place that will punish those who behave inappropriately. So we can trust that our organization is going to pay us the wage that we agreed to because there's laws that prevent them from forcing us to work without being paid. So when you have calculus-based trust, and it's generally in professional relationships, there is something that is going to prevent a person from doing something against your best interest. So you can trust that they are going to do the right thing. Because there will be legal ramifications or professional ramifications if they don't. So that's a calculus based trust. We're going to tell the truth and do the right thing at work because we have to. There's laws, legal ramifications, or punishments if we don't. Now, identification based trust has more to do with relationship based belief in someone that they can identify with our personal interests and our values. And so we believe that we can trust them to look out for our best interests because they believe in us, they care about us, they identify with who we are. So this is a more personal level. They aren't acting in a trustworthy manner necessarily because they have to, but because they actually believe in who you are. So, some concepts about trust is what you will also see in Chapter 7. And there is just a wealth of information in Chapter 7. I encourage you to read through it carefully because there's much more concepts in here that explain the concepts of communication and how communication is done. Much more than we can go over in a 15-minute video. Um, so I do want to take a little bit of time though and talk about the cross-cultural relationship concepts in chapter 8. So when you go to chapter 8, you're going to find a few topics there that you will find interesting. When we look at the concept of high and low context cultures, high context cultures are situations where there's a lot of inference, a lot of context is required. So you can't necessarily take words themselves at face value. You have to consider things like body language, status, and other contextual clues to really understand what is meant or what's expected. That's a high context culture. In low context culture, you can rely more heavily on specific codes like language. You can deal with exactly what is being said without as much concern about body language, facial expressions, and things like that that we may not be aware of. So the United States, of course, the U.S. is a low context culture. We have a more, in some ways, the direct sense of communication. In high context cultures, is where we may find it challenging to go from the US to a high context culture because we aren't aware of cultures, body language, social status issues that can affect how people take our words. So this is one of the things that is a challenge of working internationally is understanding if it's a high context culture, how your behavior feeds into the communication process. Um, and so that's one concept that you're going to read about. You're also going to read about the idea of polychronicity and monochronicity. And it's just like they sound. Monochronicity is a preference for scheduling tasks one at a time. And polychronicity is a preference for having multiple activities at the same time. So when you have polychronic cultures, they're going to emphasize uh, completing transactions, whereas monochronic cultures are looking at adherence to the schedule. So it's just a different mindset of whether you're concerned about following your schedule and your exact list, whereas polychronic culture is more concerned about the number of transactions and accomplishments that are being made throughout the day. So it's just a different focus on how to get work completed, how work is looked at in different countries. Again, in North America, we're considered to be monochronic. We want to follow the schedule. And in other areas of the world, uh, they are more, even more monochronic considered than us, such as Japan. And there's other cultures that also have different ideas about how closely the schedule should be followed versus just getting certain things accomplished in your work. Another concept I think you will be interested in is the idea of a psychological contract. In a psychological contract, we have beliefs about what the exchange between ourselves and our employer is supposed to look like. We have the notion of what we're supposed to do as workers, what the company is supposed to do as far as providing job security. And this can change. Our psychological contracts may change over time. There was a time when people expected that we would work hard for a company and we would stay for 30 years and we would retire from there. And that was what was expected. We would do that and the company would provide us with a pension. Now, people have a different psychological contract often that we will move around and we will go to the company that has the best benefits, the best package for us. We're not going to stay beyond what the company is able to provide for us, um, as far as meeting our specific salary needs. Nowadays it's expected that if companies don't provide you with what you're looking for, that you'll be moving on. So it's just differences in how people look at the employment contract, so to speak. And then when you look at the idea of cultural intelligence, this is an understanding of the ability to think about your own behavior. So when we are looking at people who have high cultural intelligence, they often will observe cues to others' behavior and try to make some sense of what that person is experiencing so that they understand, in a sense, what that person is coming from. Then they will also have the motivation to try to understand other people. This is a concept of cultural intelligence, is looking at the behavior of others, trying to understand them, and then trying to respond to them in a way that they will understand. So I think some of these concepts, high low text, low context cultures, monochronic, polychronic cultures, psychological contracts, and cultural intelligence, I think these particular items will help you in answering the questions on the second part of the assignment for this week, where we're talking about Lincoln Electric. And this firm had some challenges in trying to open an international location. So when you're looking for specific concepts that might relate to the issues they had, these might give you some starting points. I also want to quickly point out that we do have our first quiz of the class in week 4. So make sure that as you have time, you're reviewing the textbook website and doing the practice quizzes, and be prepared to take a quiz this week in addition to the assignment and discussion. Have a great week. I look forward to talking with you in discussion.